I mentioned to some of the people here who were here last session that some of the stuff is going to be, a little bit of it is going to be repeated, but we're going to focus on Tier 2 and Tier 3. So let me give kind of an overview about what we're going to do here. 3 things about what we're going to focus on today. And I'm notorious for leaving stuff sitting someplace. 3 things. Once we move out of Tier 1, we have some additional factors to consider. One is, how do we have a process of collaborating and planning together now that other people might be involved in the instruction of the student? Does that make sense? It's not just one teacher anymore. The second issue is, how do we construct the content of the instruction? What are the characteristics of instruction in Tier 2 and Tier 3? How do they differ from each other? How do we know when to move? And how do they link with Tier 1? But the third issue, which tends to be one of the more complicated, is how do you schedule it? The time factor. That's the real issue. So for those of you, how many of you have been into one of the other sessions that I've done here? Okay, thank you for telling me that, so I don't want to make any assumptions. So some basic considerations about MTSS. Tier 1 defines what everybody gets, right? Well, you have to define that. That's Tier 1, what everybody gets. But you also have to put in there the time, because the tiers are differentiated not only by who gets it, but how much time they get, what the focus of the instruction is, and the type of instruction. The where is not as important as the time, the focus, and the type. So in the state where, and I'm not going to tell you a bunch of stuff about myself because it takes up a couple of minutes and we don't have those minutes. You'll just decide whether this is beneficial to you or not, and what you know about me isn't going to help you one way or the other. So in where I'm from Florida. It's where I spend most of my time. This time of year, though, when I want warm weather, I come to Indiana. I'm not sure that you're a whole lot warmer than we were down there when I left. We were in the 50s, and so I don't want to spoil anybody. We want you to come to Florida on your spring break. We want you to spend massive amounts of money, and then we want you to leave quickly so you don't use too many of our resources, but you leave a lot of money behind. We don't have any income tax in Florida, so we need you to pay our state income tax. We have something called the Academic Support Plan, and it defines, for example, for literacy, that the ELA block in elementary is 90 minutes. Tier 2 is up to 45 minutes more. Tier 3 is up to 45 minutes more. So it's base plus 50 off the base again. So a total of 180 minutes. So clearly, the time in Tier 1 determines what Tier 2 and Tier 3 are going to be, because they have to be more. But the more time Tier 1 takes up, the less time you have to do Tier 2 and Tier 3. So there is this real reciprocal relationship. So you first always define what is Tier 1 for the curricular area at your level of instruction, elementary, middle, high school. What is that? High school, you may be 50-minute or you may be 100-minute blocks, or something close to those. And then you build Tier 2 and Tier 3 on top of that for the time factor. That's really important. So Tier 2 is what some kids get. Some kids imply less than all. So that implies group. It's more time, narrower focus, and perhaps a different type of instruction. Perhaps not. I'm going to give you a high school example where it's not. Tier 3 is beyond that. We're going to talk a little bit about Tier 3. It's very, very different from Tiers 1 and 2. They're more alike. Tier 3 has a different purpose. It's what very few kids get. It's even more time, narrower focus, and probably narrower instructional strategies. You have to make decisions about where does a kid go, when, those types of things. Now, it is totally possible that Tier 2 and Tier 3 instructional strategies can be delivered in Tier 1. Every general education teacher, when they differentiate instruction and then they differentiate for that outlying kid, they're probably meeting the characteristics of Tier 3. But they can only spend a little bit of time doing it because they have 26 other kids in the class. Tier 3 is really designed, and my learning history has been, I will ask a general education teacher, when you have the time and you're differentiating to the max and you're scaffolding to the max and the kid is being successful, tell me what you're doing. Because Tier 3 is a lot of that. But tap general education teachers' brains first. They're in the class with you. You don't have to do a bunch of assessments and what have you. Just ask the teacher, have you, if you had only this kid, do you have stuff that works? And the teacher goes, absolutely. Describe in detail what you're doing. And then we will utilize those already effective strategies, but give them in dosages significant enough to move the kid. So you have to have an understanding of what those tiers are. Is that enough for now? So there's one caveat to this. We seldom, if ever, do academic instruction in Tier 3 for individual students. It's small group. The research on instruction for kids in public schools getting intensive kinds of instruction, both for academics and social emotional behavioral, is that a very small group has a bigger effect size than if you're working with a kid individually. And if you take this down to the kindergarten level, how much can you pound the brain of a 5-year-old by themselves? Also modeling, seeing other kids do stuff, the vicarious learning that occurs when I'm working with you and the other two are watching and now it's your turn and the two of you are watching, it's much more effective. Now speech therapists and others that do individual stuff, that I'm not talking about that. So what you're thinking of is everybody, groups of kids, and very small groups of kids. That's what it would look like. Where it happens, the tiers don't exist. It's just a way to visually describe intensifying instruction. You can do that anywhere. You can deliver specially designed instruction anywhere. There's nothing magic to the room. There's no dust. There's no value addedness to the wall coverings. So, however, once you get to Tier 2 and Tier 3, we're going, I don't have this in the slides, but I will, this is easy for you to write down. We have a decision tree. It's called time, what, who, where. And it's the Dr. Seuss approach to instructional development. Because what if the what that the kid needs is not in the skill set of the who, and the who doesn't have the time? So if you know the what and you know the who, but the who doesn't know what to do and the who doesn't have the time, then all the what in the world isn't going to help the kid. Get it? So we never decide what first. That's a sucker trap. Because you'll spend all this time deciding the what, and then what do you say? I don't have the time. So now everything you did is blown open. So get the time first. That's why you have the time guidelines. Tier 1 plus 50, up to 50, plus up to 50% more. So if this kid is going to need more than 45 more minutes of help a day, that's going to demand you skip Tier 2 and go to Tier 3. Our general guideline is, if kids are less than a year behind, Tier 2 is likely to be pretty impactful. If they are more than a year, and especially a year and a half behind, skip Tier 2, because it's not going to be enough. So there's a whole thing about MTSS, and we talked about it last session. Obviously, core instruction has to be very effective. You can't have an ineffective core instruction that keeps passing off kids to Tier 2 and Tier 3. because typical schools only have the resources to handle about 6% of their kids in real Tier 3, and you'll see why when we get to it. You can generally handle around 14-15% in Tier 2 with typical staffing patterns, but no more than 20% of the kids needing extra help. You don't have the staff for it. How many of you in here are administrators? Okay, well, you can look at it, you know the triangle? And by the way, if you're an MTSS person, your whole world is triangles. You put everything into a triangle. You make your garage organized into a triangle. You dream triangles, all of that kind of stuff. So the rule is 80-14-6. For administrators, district or school, take the staff allocated to Tier 1. And now take all the other staff you have, and I'll bet you it's not 20% of your total staff for Tier 2 and Tier 3, and put them up there. Now put how many kids you have in each tier. And if you find out that your triangle is an hourglass, and that your Tier 2 is a pass-through to Tier 3, which is a prerequisite to special ed, and you're going to have all these kids in Tier 3 and you have 2 staff allocated to it. I don't care how good the 2 staff are. You can't handle that many kids in Tier 3. It's the peanut butter theory. You have a tablespoon of peanut butter and a big loaf of Italian bread, and your goal is to be sure all the bread is covered, all the kids get services. You spread it so thin that when you take a bite of the bread, you don't taste the peanut butter. So this model is a return on investment model. You have to allocate staff to the effort, and the effort is what percent of your kids are going to need the services, and it generally comes down to core instruction is not effective, and they're depending upon Tier 2 and Tier 3 to fix kids they don't know how to deal with. So it always tends to wrap back around to that. Does all that make sense to you? And I'll answer a lot of your questions from this base. At no point as an educator have I ever been willing to give up common sense. If something stinks, it stinks. If it doesn't make sense, then why in the hell are we doing it? And you have good sense. And if you're sitting in a meeting and you're like, what? Then say, what? So in this case, you know, if you started having, is this Tier 2 or Tier 3? I would rather you spend the time saying, what is the more effective instruction, this one or this one? Remember, the only time the kids improve is when they're actually getting good instruction for their needs. All the meetings we have, all the labels we have, all the models we have, everything we have is not going to help kids unless it's tied to instruction, and instruction is what moves kids. So, first thing that we're going to talk about very briefly, and we talked about it a lot, I'm looking for my clicker, it's not going to be helpful, is the collaboration part. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because it's really kind of commonsensical, and I want to spend more time on the deeper side of it. I was talking to some people at the break, and when I was a building principal for more than a decade, and when I first became a building principal and went and was doing evaluations and walkthroughs, I was pretty disconcerted about what I was seeing, which I kind of labeled for myself random acts of instruction. And I couldn't make sense out of it. I'd go to different third grade classes, and it was just all over the place. And the building required that we needed to improve the performance of all of the kids, and there just wasn't any consistency. And kind of, you know, being a sports person, anytime that there's a bad performance, whether it's sports, whether it's the performing arts or what have you, it usually reflects poor planning. Not enough planning, not the right planning, etc. So I started going to grade level planning meetings to see if the planning was really good and the execution was not good, or what's going on. I had to look at the process. The planning was not good. The planning meetings were more social than they were not. There was no structure to them. There was no, we start off with a standard, learning goal, access skills, that kind of stuff. It was putting down instructional stuff while people were socializing. And I'm probably overstating that, but that's the message that I wanted to give. So I started doing evaluations and walkthroughs of PLC planning meetings to get some structure to the planning so that everybody understood what everybody was doing, and all of a sudden things started improving because teachers had great skills. They just lacked the structure necessary to do it consistently. That was a system problem. It was not a teacher problem. But then the other issue was with our kids with disabilities, it wasn't doing much for them. And as I said the previous hour, in virtually every school district in the United States, the lowest performing group of the 8 groups from No Child Left Behind, the 5 racial ethnic groups, kids with disabilities, kids on economic disadvantage, and English language learners, kids with disabilities are the lowest performing. And a disability does not mean that you cannot achieve. It never has. It means that we have to find other ways for these kids to access the content that they need to know in order to be productive. There's absolutely no excuse for the fact that nationally only around 30% of kids with disabilities are proficient. That whole group is just, I just don't get it. So it is a target group, but in this planning process we developed, they didn't fit. So we didn't want them to be like the bucket that catches kids. So we developed this lesson study process to deal with communication and collaboration to achieve the following goal. Ensure that everybody delivering instruction to any kid, in groups, individually, what have you, that instruction was aligned with standards, the scope and sequence of the instruction followed Tier 1, and that the pacing of the instruction followed Tier 1. So in order for that to happen, we had to have reading teachers, special ed teachers at the planning meetings so they knew what was going on in Tier 1 so they could align their stuff with it. Does that make sense? All right. So we developed something called lesson study. And it's really, you know, whenever you try to put structure to describe something that's pretty common sense and that it is much easier than the description, that's what's happened here. I have not found an easy way to describe it succinctly. So I'm going to walk you through the steps, and if you can find an easier way to put the model together, I would certainly appreciate knowing about it. And I will follow your lead on that. So I'm going to kind of go over this model overall very quickly, and then we're going to break it down into each of the tiers, what it looks like for Tier 2, what it looks like for Tier 3. So very quickly, and before Stephen was here with a group of people, there were 4 or 5 people from a particular building, so I kept using them as an example. That PLC, I made them all 5th grade. What did I make them all? 5th grade, 6th grade, something like that. Made them all 6th grade teachers. You're doing your lesson planning for a month. That's what we do for a month. You can alter it weekly, but the bulk of it is done for a month. And the reason for that is we gather a lot of people at this meeting, and we can't be doing that every week. It would be a scheduling nightmare. So at this first meeting, everybody is there. I'm going to make this the team, 6th grade teachers, and they have standards that they're looking at. They're going to develop the learning goals for those standards. They're going to identify the instructional strategies for those standards, and they're going to identify how they're going to measure student progress. Those are the 4 big ideas about instructional planning. What's the standard? What's the goal? What are the strategies? How do we evaluate it? That's pretty standard across the group. Also with the standards, we start by breaking a standard down by saying, what do we want kids to know, understand, and do? The cut. Knowing is the nouns in the standard. What you got to know is the nouns. It's that simple. And what kids got to do is the verb. So we do nouns and verbs. Here's what they know. Here's what they got to do. So that is what happens at this meeting. And then we define the access skills that kids have to have. So if the standard is comprehension from a fable, a story, whatever, identifying key details and conveying the main idea, whatever. That sounds standard-ish, cuts across a bunch of them. What skills do kids have to do that? They might have to read 100 words a minute. They might have to be able to write sentences. They might have to know background what a myth, a fable, or a main idea is. These are prerequisite skills that will be used now to attain this next standard. Well, you deal with this all the time. What do you do when you have a standard at 6th grade and the kids' access skills are at 4th grade? A teacher brought that up in the last session. 6th grade math, I think, and the kids were 3 years behind in math facts. How do you deal with that? So at this meeting, these people talk about what they're going to be doing for the general ed kids. I'll mention one other thing, and then I think I have the slide here. We also have incorporated at this level universal design for learning. How many of you are familiar with UDL? Okay. We don't look at it quite the same way. We're not looking at it as tools, like text-to-speech or what have you. We're looking at it as how we think about instruction, delivering it. So you know there are 3 principles to UDL, and if you haven't had this elsewhere, you get all of the downloads for all the... Go to one of my other presentations, and you'll find the UDL stuff in there. But there are 3 principles. How are we going to, how many methods or how many ways are we going to represent the instruction, deliver it? Visually, graphically, verbally, tactily, whatever. The second design principle is how many different ways are we going to have students demonstrate it, represent to us what they've learned. And then the third one is focusing around student engagement strategies. So as they lay out standard goal instructional strategies, and I asked this group the actual numbers, they have 28 kids in a classroom, and 7 of them either have special needs or need some kind of heavily focused instruction. That's about the national average. It's about 8 out of 25, about a third of kids. So that everything they just planned for the 21 kids is not likely to work for the 7. That's where we start thinking about other people, other tiers. So at the table would be special ed reading, whomever, counselor, school psychologist, if we're talking about behavioral issues. And they're listening to this, and they're thinking about their kids. Does that make sense? Are they going to be able to do that? What's the pacing? What are the expectations? So 2 things happen. 1, they can convey those issues to the gen ed team. But more importantly, they are saying, here is what I have to do in order to get the kids ready that I work with to do that. So now there's alignment with pacing, with content, with teaching method, with materials. And now we're beginning the process of collaboration. So the most effective strategy, if we're going to name one overall strategy for kids who struggle, whether they're special ed or not, is pre-teach, review, and reteach. They need more exposure to it. They need an advanced organizer to deal with background information. It's highly effective. So for everything at Tier 2, Tier 3, and specially designed instruction, we would expect to see a way of work of pre-teach, review, and reteach as it relates to the scope, sequence, and pacing of the content in Tier 1, regardless of what strategies we're using. So let me give you a quick example. And I'll use the example from somebody who was here yesterday. Use the same example as last time. We have a special ed teacher who is exclusively working in the IEP on blending. Kid knows sound symbol association. Kid even knows a lot of the meaning of the words but can't blend them. So everything is ka, a, t, okay? No automaticity, obviously no fluency. So that's what the focus of that is. So in a typical method, you might be using a program. Wilson's Foundations, something like that. That's all well and good. And I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying don't do it for the whole time. At the outside of my face, I'm also saying, what are the practices that Wilson's Foundations incorporates that you think are appropriate to this kid? And could we utilize those practices on another playing field? So here's the problem in elementary and beginning of intermediate or middle school. Stephen here, the normal kid, his cognitive development, depending upon where he is in here, is pre-operational or concrete. It's not 2 formal operations yet. The abstracting isn't there as a fluent skill. So unless there's a concrete representation between what is occurring with the special ed teacher or Tier 2 and that general ed classroom, he cannot make the transfer. He's not cognitively there yet. That's normal developmental stuff. We can't ask Stephen to figure out how to translate what happened with a remedial reading teacher or a special ed teacher and try to figure out how to use it in core instruction. These kids don't have the skills to do that. The adults struggle. That's why we have lesson study. So we have to bridge it for the kids. So what would be an alternative to a box on a shelf or in addition to a box on the shelf? And by the way, boxes on shelves are not evidence-based. None of them is. Whether you're looking at the Florida Center for Reading Research, the Iris Center, the Von Gross Center, Instruction Center, boxes are evidence-based because they're demonstrated to contain practices that are evidence-based. The box is evidence-based because it has enough of the practices in it. That's why. But that box might not match the needs of your kid. It's evidence-based, but it may not have been evidence-based for English language learners or kids with disabilities or kids who are more than a certain degree behind. So when we were given this example, this person could continue to work on the blending. The standard requires that the word, its meaning, and its context be used to summarize, analyze, whatever. So while we're doing this blending, number one, why aren't we picking the words from the social studies book for next week to practice on instead of words out of a box that have no transferability next week to the general education setting? If you want to use the strategies, whatever the box is, to get the kid moving on it, but apply it to the actual curriculum. That's important. The other thing is, are we just going to blend words, or are we going to check for understanding? Do you know what that word means? And if the kid says no, what are you going to say? Oh, too bad. Next word. So why are we not teaching word meaning with the mechanics of fluency? And third, what is one of the biggest facilitators of fluency? It's context within which the word is embedded. So a lot of kids, even though they may not be able to read the word fluently, they have enough configuration and they derive meaning from the sentence, they get a really good guess. And then that builds fluency moving forward because the kid has learned that strategy. But here we are focusing just on blending with isolated words. So as the Tier 2, Tier 3 specially designed listens to this, they're thinking, okay, I need to know where they're going to be in the book, whether it's the math book, reading the math instructions for the algorithm, or social studies or science, use any of that. And I'm going to apply the access skill instruction on the IEP in the context of that. Is all that making sense? Okay. I just want to give you the overview because then we'll break it down as we go through it. So, you know, one of the big pushes in the last 5 to 7 years is that regardless of the content, art, music, and PE, we read across the curriculum. We do these performance standards across the curriculum. So why wouldn't you apply a comprehension standard to an art, music, PE context?
So are they sitting in too on these?
If it is appropriate, yes. My bigger question, Elaine, is are they sitting in on the PLC lesson planning, or they also have been excluded? Because traditionally when you go to lesson planning, you have the 5th grade teaching team. Yet there's 8 other people who are providing services to the kids in this building, and for whom you take all the time, those people, that's lost instructional time if the only organized sequence of instruction is for the people who are doing this. So let's say that you have a kid has an IEP as well as getting Title I. You may have that kid out 100 minutes a day out of 350. So we're only going to organize the instruction for that kid for the 250 minutes and let the other 100 hang out there and we hope we get lucky with it? That makes no sense, because remember, academic engaged time predicts growth, academic growth, better than any other piece of data, assuming it's to quality instruction. A lot of crap isn't going to help anybody. A lot of good stuff is. So those are really good questions you're asking. So it's kind of like if you go to family therapy and you have, two primary adults raising a kid, but you also have an extended family, and only one of them is in therapy, learning all this cool stuff. Why would we do that? It's bad enough if your husband, wife, partner, you've got kids, the two of you staying on the same page with your kids truly is a struggle. Just put it that way. 3 kids and 7 grandkids. I've had lots of experience with it. So that's the general idea. So I don't care whether you go through these steps. How do you communicate across all providers to ensure that all instruction is aligned and paced? And for kids below the 6th grade level or so, how do we ensure that the concrete application of it is honored? That's the goal. All right. So now, with that general process, let's start looking at content. I put this in here because it's in some of it's not in the thing for today, for this session, but I have it in other sessions because I've had lots of questions. There should be a core of evidence-based instructional practices for the content being discussed in these meetings. This is from the Florida Center for Reading Research. It is for literacy only, and it is the 10 most highly effective instructional practices for reading. So that forms our base. It's everybody's base. If we want to deviate from it, that's fine, but we got to have a reason. But we have to have a core that we have PD on, a core that everybody starts from. Otherwise, every one of these lesson planning meetings is a free-for-all. Well, let's try this, or let's try that, or let's try this. So there has to be this core. I will also, just as an aside, tell you that on our larger school districts, primarily, we have a core of Tier 2. Wilson's Foundations happen to be one of them. Things like Read 180 happen to be one of them. If it is evidence-based and is part of the core for Tier 2, professional development and coaching is available for everyone who uses it. But to use it, you have to have had the professional development, and the computer system knows if you have or you haven't. So we don't have teams launching off into Tier 2 and Tier 3 to deliver instruction that staff have not been trained in. So we have less is more. There might be 10. There's not 10 for Tier 2 for literacy, but here's say 10. Every building in the district has one person who is the point person for that program or practice. So I can tell you, there is one person in every building who is the go-to person for Wilson's Foundations. Every single building. If David here wants to use it for a group of kids, and the materials and what have you are provided, he selects it. It's a bigger system than this. He picks it, and his number isn't in there for being trained. He is then given Brooks' name, and the email goes to you too, saying he wants to use that. He hasn't had PD in it. It tells you when the next PD session in the district is for Wilson's Foundations for elementary, and identifies Brooke as your go-to person in your building to ask for help. Because one of our biggest issues with moving kids, particularly kids with disabilities, is using non-evidence-based strategies delivered with poor fidelity. So this computer system, now we can't have that for 150 interventions. So if you want to use an intervention that's not adopted by the district, there's nothing to stop you, but all the supports are not there. So guess what people gravitate to? The ones with the supports. which are the most evidence-based. And in these districts, they also track student performance by race, grade, gender, socioeconomic status, disability, and language. And every time a kid takes an assessment who's using that method for fluency, they know all of that about the kid. And you slowly over time get a district database to say, this works really well with low socioeconomic English language learners. It does not work very well with kids. So you can have a system that you tie the method, and all of this helps your system become smarter and smarter and smarter. In the absence of that, you do what you have. So the first question is, you can't have special ed teachers with 12 kids trying to teach them for 14 different strategy combinations. So we kind of constrain Tier 1. Developing a schedule. Developing a schedule is critical. If you don't have the time, you can't do the what. Even if you know the what and you have a who knows how to do it and aware that the who is in. And let me do just for a moment the Dr. Seuss reverse of this. For too many years we've identified kids with disabilities, and that determines the who the kid goes to. Or what if the who doesn't have the time? Or what if the who has the time doesn't know the what? How could we ever expect learning disabilities teachers to know every instructional strategy that a disability with 150 different causes is defined by? That's craziness. So if we determine the disability first and go to who, then the who has to have the time the kid needs, but let's say the who only has half the time, so now the intensity gets dropped. And even if the who knows how to do the what, there's not enough of the what to move the kid because the time is down. So it really is the time, what, who, and the where doesn't matter. And by law, definition, a special education environment is defined by wherever a special education kid is, not where the teacher is. The kid's DNA in a room defines it as a special education environment, because now that environment has to be responsive to the kid. So let me give you an example. I picked a 4th grade schedule because it kind of bridges the gap. This is one of our typical 4th grade schedules designed to have multi-tiered system for literacy. So therefore we want 180 minutes a day available up to that for literacy instruction for all 3 tiers. The time. By the way, if you can only come up with 120, you can't have tier 3. Sorry, you got to knock it off your triangle. You can't do it. So, and the other thing to remember is tier 1 is what everybody gets. Tier 3 is the most a building can give a kid. Tier 2 is in the middle. Now you know that the triangle is really defined by the building. Some buildings have more resources, can give kids more stuff. So you can't have a district definition of those tiers. You can have a general definition, but when you define tier 3 as the most a building can give, that may be different for this building than that building, and that's just reality. So let's look at this. How do we get 180 minutes the easiest way? Well, a couple of things. Number one, where our schedule tends not to be the same every day. And you're going to see that with the high school example shortly. So we have 90 minutes here, 30 minutes here, 60 minutes here. That's 180. Our most typical way of doing this, kind of get out of Lane's question sideways a little bit, is we fold social studies into literacy. It's not separate. We teach reading in the process of doing social studies. And all the reading instruction applies to the social studies. So there's no reason why we also then couldn't grab 20 minutes in music. I mean, do kids just go in there and sing, or do they actually learn stuff about music and read? Same thing with PE. There are rules to games, right? So that's how we get it most often. The other thing we do that helps us is that we block our elementary schedules when we can. Meaning that specials, just generic term, it's not very fair to that, but I don't have to say all of the stuff, are given to all kids in a grade level at the same time. They just divide up. Art, music, PE, technology, whatever the case may be. And that's planning time for that grade level team. Data analysis. It's not lesson study, but it's looking at data, that type of stuff. No, yes. No, it's not actually. This is teacher time. The 30 is here. Oh, I'm sorry. Down here. I saw reading. This is stupid. It's stupid.
Yeah.
Those of you who are in classrooms, seriously, with a diverse group of kids who have a bunch of learning needs, you're actually going to stop them doing one thing, get them super engaged in a learning mode in something else, and get them out of it in 10 minutes? No. You know what? I would say I would use duct tape and Velcro at that point and take a break. Tie them all to their seats and say, do what you can in your seat, but I'm taking a 10-minute break. I'm done with you. Here's the other thing I want you to look at in grabbing time. So this school makes this work out. It makes it work. Typically, in an MTSS school, math is in the afternoon, but not always. I'm going to point out two other things to you, and then we'll move on for time. If you count the number of transitions, there are 11. I will tell you, if you're really awesome, and I mean awesome, you lose only 8 minutes for each transition. And I don't mean that's butts in seats. I mean the kids are engaged, so when you end something that they're engaged in, and then you start the timer when they're fully engaged in the next thing, it's at least 8 minutes. We're not moving kids around like they are in high school. They've lost 90 minutes of instruction here with 11 transitions. That is a quarter of the day. So if buildings want to find time, extra time to give kids, it's there. This is self-imposed. The other thing is that this is the 4th grade schedule. Schedules follow kids. If this schedule is meeting the needs of the 4th grade kids when they go to 5th grade, that schedule goes with them. Because the schedule is working for them. All the other support staff are already tied into a schedule when they take kids out and stuff. Why would we want remedial, special ed, speech therapy? Why would they have to blow up their whole schedule? They should only blow it up for kindergartners. Everyone else they've been working with on a schedule that works, the cohort just moves. So that's another issue. The last point here is that there's another way to do this as we transition to Tier 2. If you have multiple teachers, and you don't even have to have even numbers, we break up reading instruction and we sequence it. So let's say you have 3 teachers in a grade level. One teaches reading from 8 to 9:30, one teaches it from 9:30 to 11, and another one teaches it in another hour and a half break, an hour and a half sequence. If you have 6 of them, you do 2, 2, and 2. So if you have kids that just need more time, how many of you know that if you had more time, you wouldn't have to have specialized instruction? These kids came in with lack of background knowledge, blah, blah. They just need more time. Think of yourself taking statistics. You studied harder. What does that mean? You put in more time. You needed more time. You didn't have to have specially designed instruction for statistics. You didn't go get qualified for special ed at the university, and then you get an IEP for statistics. You put in more effort and time going over the same stuff. So here's what we do. Our Tier 2 in those schools is you get your reading language arts, and if you need another do-over of the basic group instruction, you go to another classroom that is doing the first 45 minutes of their instruction. Because the teachers are all paced, they're doing the same stuff. And our reading blocks tend to be 45 minutes of some type of group instruction, and then with either centers or what have you, where we're focused on application and skills. So you can actually have kids get a double scoop if you stagger when teachers teach reading at a grade level, if you have more than one teacher. That's another way to get more time for kids. So you automatically have another 45 minutes.
This might be a stupid question, but do they not have recess?
We don't have recess in Florida. We do not.
You have PE every day.
We have PE every day.
So.
And it's funny you asked the question. You're the only person who ever has noticed that without me prompting it.
We all are like.
All right.
Our schools still do 2 or 3, so
Right.
teachers would throw a fit.
Exactly. No recess duty at this school. There's technology duty, there's whatever. But interesting, as we stand here, Florida is weird. The legislature wants to micromanage education. And I understand it, but I don't understand it. So right now, there's somebody trying to float a bill to put recess in Florida schools. And it's like, why? Kids, there's not a little kid revolt. We're not having demonstrations. And the kids don't seem any worse to wear.
So no grades have recess?
Is the PE guided or?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yes. There's a curriculum for PE, standards, absolutely, totally guided. This is not free for all.
It's not recess.
No, absolutely not. It is a very structured, PE is tied into the standards, it's sequenced, paced, all of that kind of stuff. Yes. But we don't. But if I come back at some point in the future here, I may have to tell a different story. Because if enough parents and what have you get to the legislators, then we're going to have recess. And then, of course, when scores drop, loss of academic engaged time, get what you pay for. So, okay. So that's about that schedule. So you can do it. You can do it. Let me show you the high school schedule. This is for high school. We just started doing this. We started doing this about a little over a year ago. Yeah, a year ago. This is Mashpee High School in Massachusetts. They were having problems with kids in algebra. So they have their algebra teachers all teach 4 periods a week. 4 sections a week, a day. Each teacher has an accelerated group, 2 regular groups, and a strategic group. Strategic is a nice way of saying behind, okay? And when we've been helping them implement MTSS there for about 2 years, and they're knocking it out of the park. We talked about pre-teach, review, and reteach as the dominant Tier 2 strategy. And we'll talk about why in a moment. And so Mark Balistracci, the principal, at a break when we do MTSS training for a district, we start off with, after doing the district team, we don't actually do a lot of the training. We teach the district, people in the district how to do it, and then we support them. So we always start out with principals and 1 person from each school. They get pre-trained. Pre-teach, review, reteach. As a building principal for 12 years, I hated going to professional development with my staff where we were supposed to do some kind of planning and stuff, and I didn't have a clue about where this was going, what it was going to be. I couldn't provide the structure, the support, the leadership. So everything I do with districts, we have building principals and a person from that building come and get trained first. So that when the school-based leadership teams get trained, they can be internal coaches to that process. So we took a break one day and he goes, George, I understand how I would do this pedagogically. Talk to me again about the pre-teach, review, and reteach. So I talked to him about that and he goes, well, pre-teach really becomes reteach and reteach becomes pre-teach. I said, you got it. You got it. You got the pedagogy. He says, I can work on the schedule. Here's what he implemented. Each teacher, because they teach 4 sections, and he released them from something else they had to do, taught 2 extra sections a week, or a subset of teachers, taught 2 extra sessions a week to the strategic group. So instead of getting 5 sessions of 60 minutes, they got 7. So if you do the math on your paper, 5 times 60 is 300. 7 times 60 is 420. So these kids got 120 minutes a week more, which is almost 50%. Right? 50% would have been 450. They got 420. That's close. It didn't have to be 50%. And they got it every week. Taught by the same teachers that they had, with the same books, and no specialized instruction. Within 4 months, the strategic group had almost come close to the regular group. Within 6 months, that group's overall performance in the electronic gradebook was 8% higher than the regular group. And at the end of the year, nobody in that group failed freshman algebra, and 82% of the kids got C or higher, and 18% got Ds. But they were all failing to begin with. That's Tier 2. Why is it Tier 2? Because they got more time. The teachers focused the instruction on what they weren't understanding from Tier 1, and they didn't have to have a lesson planning meeting. They went to a mirror and said, what did you teach this morning? Well, I taught this. What didn't the kids understand? Well, they didn't understand this. What are you going to do in the extra session? Well, I think I will do this. It was perfect alignment.
What did they do the other 3 days?
They did whatever they were doing before. They were only teaching 4 sections a day. So those kids, the regular kids, are getting algebra every day.
Right, but so you're pulling.
This was
periods, but
they scheduled those kids so that it didn't target any critical areas. And now you're asking a high school question, okay?
Yeah.
So
I mean, was it like a study time?
it depended on the kid, what they weren't in. But it was either advisement stuff, electives. So here's for those of you at the secondary level. If you're doing interventions, you have to, and you're taking up elective time, you have to be sure that the interventions meet the course code directory for credit. Most high schools can give remedial credit up to a limited amount. You don't want to be doing interventions at high school without giving the credit. Because let's say we flipped Kendra here past Algebra 1. But she did it at the expense of losing a half a credit for an elective. You're still in credit recovery. Credit recovery is the death at high school. So if you're doing Tier 2 like this, be sure that what you're doing will allow you to assign a remedial credit. So they were getting a half a credit for the regular algebra, they're getting a half a credit for the remedial, and that took up what they lost for the elective. Beyond that, I can't tell you exactly what every kid got pulled out of, because
You mentioned maybe you could do the same thing with English.
Oh, absolutely. They've expanded this.
Could be English.
This high school's Tier 2, their go-to pedagogy is this. And you know that English, literature, whatever you want to call it, and algebra are the 2 critical courses that predict how kids will do in everything else. So they are always the target for Tier 2. The goal of our MTSS schools at high school is no kid comes out of 9th grade in credit recovery. So what we've had to do is create 9th grade academies. Those 9th graders are treated differently. In our middle school, the 6th graders are treated differently. In middle schools, we give pseudo credit for courses to acculturate middle school kids to what high school credit means by pre-teaching credit. So those kids come out of 8th grade knowing whether they're getting credit, and they've been doing it for 3 years. Those are just common sense things, okay? Does that make sense? Okay. This is the planning sheet that we use. Your IEP IEP Resource Center has developed, and I said this earlier, has developed a standards-aligned IEP professional development. They took this kind of format and made it their own, and they are doing trainings around the state, and I'll say it again. Indiana is so far ahead of every other state in the nation on aligning IEPs with standards and ensuring that kids with disabilities have a better shot at doing well on demonstrating their attainment of the standards. You guys are so far ahead of everybody else, and you should be very, very proud of that. So I'm going to put this into a form, and just, you have the form. I've already said all this, so here's what we would do. You have the standard. Determine a theme or central idea of a text and how it is conveyed through particular details. Provide a summary of the text distinct from personal opinions and judgments. Circle the verbs. Determine, convey, provide. That's what kids have to do. The nouns, they have to know themes, central ideas, details. They have to know what a summary is. And they have to know what personal opinion is, because they can't use that. That's background knowledge. Or you got to teach it. So if this is the standard, special ed teacher is here and looks at this, listens to this, and sees that her kids are missing some of this stuff. Now, when she pre-teaches and she's doing blending, why not do blending with words like theme, moral, fable, and then find out if they know it. And if not, pre-teach it. Give them an example. That's how a special ed teacher would be organically tucked into the standards. The next thing is access skills. We already talked about what do kids have to do to access that. They may have to read at a certain word, they have to write things, etc. What academic behaviors do they have to have? And we're not talking about that here. I don't think I have it up there. But these are behaviors you engage instruction with: listening, following directions, asking questions, that type of stuff. You can go back and look at one of the other presentations for the list of those. And now we come down to the last thing. How are we going to use universal design to minimize the impact of access skills that our kids don't have? So we'll do a case study with that very quickly. The universal design strategies, I'm going to say to the group, Steve can't read a grade level. He has good comprehension. He can't read. And by the way, you know, if you can't read, you can't spell. If you can spell and you can't read, it's because you're memorizing letter sequences. So therefore, if you can't read, you can't write. Because writing does require spelling, or at least some semblance of it. The Chick-fil-A approach to it. You can read all the signs for Chick-fil-A even though they're all spelled all wrong. Okay? So we've got now a kid who can't read, and you're telling me you're going to be providing reading, and then as a group they're going to do X, Y, Z, and then they're each going to produce a written thing responding to certain questions. He can't read and he can't write, but he can understand the content. What are we going to do with him? So pre-teaching will help. Text-to-speech. I was telling Stephen during the break that I work with New York, the state training assistance center for the districts, and I was in a district in upstate New York that has a school that is predominantly English language learners, and parents don't, it's a little socioeconomic, parents don't speak English, and a group of women got together, primarily Hispanic women, and they took every story for every grade level in the reading series for every grade level. That I don't know if they had Pearson or what they had. And they did YouTube videos of reading it in English and reading it in Spanish. And a kid can access the YouTube with earphones, and every YouTube is identified by the book and the page number. So the teacher would simply give that to you while the other kids are reading, and you hook into it, and you are hearing what they're reading. Now, how cool is that? Right? Or, if I was a building principal now, the first thing I would ask the district for is every one of my classrooms has got to have text-to-speech, speech-to-text. We've got to. We have too many English language learners, we have too many kids who can't read, they have too many kids who can't write, and we're acting as if they're stupid, yet what's going on in their head is very higher level, and we have no way of getting it in or getting it out. And I'm not going to have teachers reading a bunch of stuff. And I don't have a whole covey of community people who are going to make YouTube videos. So anything can be converted with that software. That's what universal design is. And I'm only giving that example. But what we would say here is Stephen can't read and he can't write, but he can understand the content. He's got a learning disability in reading and writing. I don't know if he has one in writing. If he can write at the level he can read, he probably doesn't have one in writing. But at least he can't read. What are we going to do about it? But it's done here. Otherwise, here's what happens. How many of you are general education teachers? How many of you are special ed? You wait until the general education teacher tells you what is going on, and then you go in and try to rescue. It doesn't work that way. We got to prevent this. So that's what this planning sheet is for. You could make up your own. So Brian, case study, he can understand vocabulary and comprehend close to grade level. If it's presented verbally or visually verbally, he decodes at the second grade level. He spells at the second grade level, but he can verbally respond with age-appropriate language. And I use this example because Indiana's using it, U.S. Department of Education used it, and it's because it's the most frequent issue. 97% of our kids in learning disabilities are literacy, and the vast majority of those are fluency issues. And we act as if the fluency level of the kid is the ability level of the kid. And I said earlier, dyslexia, before it got one of those fancy words, used to be called word blindness. You wouldn't make a blind kid try to read, you would instantly do text-to-speech. But just because this kid can see, we have some crazy notion that we have to spend all this time teaching the kid how to decode words they already understand, and it takes time away from content. So we want whatever we're doing with decoding to include content in that process. So what we have here, I've already talked about that. These are those academic behaviors, by the way. And you will see that those are all the things that kids need to do to link to your instruction. So if we use this form, the nouns are theme, central idea, details, summary, opinions, and judgments. The verbs are determine, convey, and provide. What access skills, and these are generated actually from a planning session. What access skills must students possess? And the teachers just said, and we wrote them down. Read text fluently, listen with accuracy to text, read fluency, understand the vocabulary in the story, identify the themes and details that document, understand the difference between facts and opinions, write a summary with beginning, middle, and ending components, verbally provide a summary and give a graphic representation of that summary. So already this team was providing alternatives by the verbal summary or the graphic representation of it. What academic behaviors? They have to listen, they have to do self-instruction, self-monitoring, they have to ask questions, ask for help, and the teachers track verbal participation. Okay? So, last hour we talked about some strategies to increase student participation. Rates of reinforcement for kids who struggle, they need to be 3-to-1 to 5-to-1. Teacher has to have active supervision, meaning you don't wait for kids to react, you go to the kids to reinforce, etc. But opportunities to learn is opportunities to respond is another strategy. And I want you, how many of you are familiar with OTR? Okay. If you're not, Google it. and learn about it. It is responding with whiteboards, responding with predetermined cards, A, B, C. It tends to be whole group instruction, whether that's whole class or small group. And what the kids do is either write stuff on the whiteboard, raise the cards, or do some kind of responding where the teacher can visually see the accuracy of the kids. But there is no one-on-one. So if you're afraid your answer's wrong or what have you, everybody holds up a card, everybody holds up a whiteboard. And you learn by seeing what the other answers were. The teacher gets the sense of competency, and everybody's doing an active thing that doesn't make them shout it out. That's a very good beginning step for increasing participation of reluctant kids. They don't have to say jack. They just got to raise their hands. And if you have to write it down and you have kids with disabilities, then you could have writing down the word for some kids and the other kids just pick A, B, C, or D, or pick the word up and hold it up. They don't have to write it. You're having the same activity for everybody. So, yes? OTL? No, OTR, Opportunities to Respond. And there is a wonderful book by Kathleen Lane called Improving Behavior Success, something like that. I think the publisher is Routledge. And it focuses on the 6 behavioral strategies to increase student engagement that are embedded in the delivery of instruction. Kathleen with a K. Lane, Improving Behavior Success, or something. It's that active supervision stuff. It's not wait till the kids, it's not managing with reinforcers and that kind of stuff. All right. So what universal design strategies must be present in order to ensure access to content for students with limited access skills? So this is what they came up with. Materials presented orally, read, text-to-speech. Opportunity to produce desired outcome verbally. Resources to convert text-to-speech. Resources to create graphic representations. It could be anything, but this is what the team developed. Now notice, this was at a PLC lesson planning meeting. The next step in this process is that the Tier 2 and Tier 3 providers then meet, and specially designed instruction, then meet together and say, now, how are we going to construct what we do to align with this? So let me, in the time we have left, talk briefly about Tier 2, characteristics of instruction, and Tier 3. I've already talked about that. So once again, Tier 2 is intensifying instruction, more time, narrower focus, perhaps different type instruction. It's the second scoop concept, and it's given to larger groups of kids. We don't do diagnostics on kids for Tier 2. We group them by skill need. We problem solve the skill need, fluency, etc., and then teach them as a group. The probability is these kids don't have disabilities. For a learning disability, that's only 4% of the population at most. 4%. Where you may have 25% of your kids struggling. The kids don't need specially designed instruction. They need more instruction, more opportunities to respond, more feedback. They need more intensive instruction. So we have a rubric that we use that kind of follows the time, what, who, where. Every Tier 2 follows how often are we going to give it. Every day, Mashpee High School, twice a week. Focus of the instruction, the what the kids didn't get done well from the group instruction on the pacing chart. The format of the lesson, it is going to be reteaching. That was the primary strategy, was reteaching what we did yesterday and pre-teaching for tomorrow. Those periods were spaced on Tuesday, Thursday, so that pre-teach, review, reteach cycle could be maintained. The size of the group, in this case, it was 2 groups of kids drawn from the kids who were in those strategic groups who were struggling. Some of the kids in the strategic group were doing fine, but it was the ones who were struggling. What data was going to determine the 3 F's and the Y? Electronic gradebook. The student's performance in the regular sessions was the measure of performance, no other assessments. So chapter tests, homework, class exercises, no additional data collection. Teachers reviewed the data of these kids more frequently, but there was no additional data collection. And there was no professional development provided because these teachers were doing what they're supposed to do. And they already knew how to do that. I've already mentioned this, and by the way, for those of you who are building principals or district administrators, in order to keep the triangle from turning into an hourglass, 70% of the kids getting Tier 2 instruction have to meet standards. If any fewer than that, Tier 3 becomes too big. And you don't have the staff to do it. So in the districts we work with, I don't want to join the Hyatts. In the districts that we work with, all kids in Tier 2 are electronically identified. Their ID number, then at the end of their ID number, has a 0, 1, or 2 to say they're not getting any extra services, they're getting Tier 2 or they're getting Tier 3. We can aggregate the ones with a 1 and find out how many of them attain standards. And if it's significantly below 20%, we retake a look at how we're doing Tier 2. So how do we transition to Tier 3? We use data. So this is a case where on the left-hand side, this was a kid getting Tier 2 services. You know what an aim line is. That's where they have to go to reach the standard. And the Tier 2 was not enough. So once we had enough data, and actually this is 10th grade and that's too much data. This kid is basically flat. We should have done something here. What we're saying is Tier 2 is not working. And if Tier 2 was done with fidelity, and it was done with sufficiency, meaning the kid attended all the stuff, we amp it up to Tier 3. That's what was done in this kid's case. So where the kid was getting group study skills intervention, Tier 3 was that intervention plus a mentor, plus training the kid on self-monitoring, plus the kid doing a data review every 2 weeks. That was what Tier 3 was. And you see what happened to the student performance. So let's talk about Tier 3 quickly. And it's easy and it's hard. Tier 3 is not just an extension of Tier 2. There are some assumptions about Tier 3. If you look at this graph, this is where the kid is performing. That's where the kid needs to be. Is this kid doing a lot right, given where the standard is and where the kid is? No. Kids who get to Tier 3 have greater than a 90% chance, whether it's academics or behavior, of giving the right response to whatever the kid is asked to do, whether that's a social behavior or an academic behavior. The difference in Tier 3 is the kid is practicing primarily error patterns and practicing consistently the wrong thing. And we have to stop it. What is getting better is the kid's ability to get the answer wrong. So the key component of Tier 3 is errorless learning. The primary procedure is whatever instructional strategy you're using. And this is why we tend not to have more than 3 or 4 kids in a group. The teacher scaffolds it so that the kid's answer is correct, either socially or academically. So if you had little kids, how many of you had little kids? Have little kids. You live in the cold climate. When my daughter was born, and I lived in Indiana, she was an infant. And we did the same thing every parent does. As she got some coordination and could stand up and not fall over on her head when she stood up, we taught her how to put her coat on. And you've all done this with your kids. You lay the coat on the floor, you turn it backwards So all they have to do is put their 2 arms in the holes, lift it up, and it falls on their body, right? So my daughter learned how to do that at 1.5 years. It's like kind of like training your dog. You know, you impress people with what tricks your dog can do. And so in public, you'd throw the coat down, and this little 18-month-old would go up and put it on, and people go, ugh. And then you go, I'm such a good parent, I'm teaching my... But it's called backward chaining. So the kid, to have success, only does the skill they have in the required chain. So if you're doing math algorithms, you would scaffold everything except the thing the kid could do, and then the right answer was attained. And then as the kid acquires more skills, you remove the scaffolds. Slowly. Gradual release. But these kids are going to require that scaffolding to the max. And Tier 3 is going to be the only time that they're going to have that success, because they require that much scaffolding. So now how do we relate that to Tier 1, and then I'll let you go, because isn't our time up? Okay, so here's how we relate to Tier 1. What's your name? Because you've been nodding and being very nice.
Holly.
Holly?
Holly.
Okay. So what's your name, dude?
Dustin.
Dustin? Okay. So you are Dustin's general ed teacher. You are Dustin's special ed teacher. And you have been, or just say Tier 3, and you have been doing these strategies, and he can successfully do 6th grade algorithms with the scaffolding. But he cannot do them independently. So what you tell Holly is what that scaffolding is. Holly then has a deal with Dustin. Dustin, you can do this work. I know. What's your first name?
Julie.
Julie. But Miss Julie has told me how you can do it. So I'm going to do with you what Miss Julie does so that you'll be able to succeed with this, but I don't want you to do it unless I'm here. So you have 2 pieces of work. One that he does when you're there, and do the scaffolding that Julie taught you. The other is worksheets that he will do that are supporting his skill, but don't require that level of supervision. So this is going to be your differentiated instruction for him. Now, Julie's doing this every day, but if you can do it even 4 times in a period, he gets 20 more repetitions a week on top of what you're doing. Do you see how he's going to grow faster with that? And all you have to do is say, how do you do this? And she can either show you or say, come by, if you have a minute, I'll show you, watch me do it with him. And then all you have to do is the 2 of you come to agreement on what his independent work can be. Does that make sense to you? We want more repetitions. We want more success. And Tier 3 is the hardest to do, and you can only do it for 5 or 6% of your kids because of that level of intensity. Thank you for coming. I hope that you're taking something away from this, and have a great conference.